Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. Today you're going to hear Brad Loomis, Jeff Alberts, and Eric Helms talk to you about how we coach movement via the internet. While it's become normal for personal trainers to take their businesses online, it's still not normal for people to learn complicated movement patterns online, and it's something we've had to learn and fine-tune as a team throughout the past decade. In this episode, the guys will talk about how lack of in-person coaching can be detrimental to hypertrophy, performance, and posing all separately, how we ask for different movement goals from our physique athletes versus our strength athletes, even for the very same exercises, what an athlete can do or communicate to their coach to ensure they're getting the best outcomes possible, how to use internal and external cues with your motor pattern learning, and a whole lot more. As always, if you have any feedback or comments on this episode, go to 3dmusclejourney.com or to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/team3dmj and leave it under podcast number 156. Let's get into it. Here's our episode on teaching lifters how to move online with Jeff Alberts, Eric Helms, and Brad Loomis.
So, here we are discussing something that we've been dealing with for coming up on more than 10 years. Teaching people how to move online. And of course, the only people we care about are those who lift weights. So if you're listening and you don't lift weights, we're judging you so hard. No, but in all seriousness, this has been something that obviously any online coach who is doing predominantly bodybuilding, powerlifting, or any other kind of just general population training, if you lift weights, you have to overcome the hurdle of not being able to be physically there and demonstrate in real time. Maybe, if you get permission, touch the person, help them move, and give them in-person guidance. And I would say for our clients, since we work with a lot of competitive powerlifters and bodybuilders, that also extends to sometimes posing. That can extend to the competition lifts, which need to be to a certain standard. A technical error for a powerlifter can also mean not even getting a valid lift if we can't effectively communicate how to keep your butt down on the bench, for example. And it's not always the same. Some of the strategies we might use for posing might be different than the strategies we'd use for a powerlifter, might be different than the strategies we'd use for a bodybuilder. So Brad, I want to start with you because you used to own your own gym. You were a personal trainer like I was for a long time before you became a in-person coach. For teaching movement, how much more difficult and how well did it transfer the things you learned as a personal trainer compared to when you started working with athletes online?
Well, boy, the easy answer to that is it's much more difficult. Instructing and cueing, teaching people online, right? Because when you're on the floor training and coaching people, they're right in front of you, and you can touch them, you can move them, you can demonstrate, they can touch you, it's I don't know, it's just much more, three-dimensional, I guess you might say, as opposed to two-dimensional. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I guess that's the obvious answer, is that it's much more difficult online. How much transferred over? Gosh, I don't know. That's kind of a hard question to answer because I don't know. Especially when we first started coaching, I don't think any of it transferred over because, shoot, it was not until I want to say like our fourth or fifth year of coaching that we actually started recording vlogs. And man, that was a game changer right there for me anyway. Because those first 4 years, really, we couldn't coach much on cueing and good technique other than, okay, watch this video, because we didn't have that foresight at the time to say, okay, well, I'm just going to record myself doing this, right? And so then once we started making vlogs, that was a game changer for me because then it kind of got more back into that coaching and training people on the floor. It was at least a close second, right? Towards like, okay, and my clients have seen this, I'll either take them back to my weight room or right here in the next room, I'll prop up the phone. I'll say, okay, here's what I'm doing. Here's what I'm thinking. Here's what you want. Here's what you want to have happen. And that was big for me. And that's where most of the crossover came from, me being able to demonstrate for somebody right there in front of them live to having at least somewhat of the same effect online.
Yeah. Yeah. I also worry sometimes when I see people who their entire career has been as an online coach, that they don't necessarily have the juxtaposition of saying, hey, here was the more intuitive, natural, or quote unquote natural way of teaching someone how to move is showing them, having them try it, giving them feedback, pointing out certain things, etc. When you give someone, let's say circa 2010 or 11, when you give someone just a whole bunch of like text written instructions, even when they're accompanying like a picture, like I remember I used to have like arrows going to things like, don't do that, like keep the bar close to your shin, or see how your shoulder blades are pinched, 2 arrows together, push them out that way. It's also just not the way you learn how to move. Like if you think about it, like what is happening on the client's end? They sit down in front of their 2011 here, they're not on their phone, right? So they're looking at their computer sometime on Friday night, getting their coach's feedback, and they're expecting the next time they deadlift, next Thursday, to then retain what they learned and incorporate that into the movement, and then get feedback from you a week later as to how well they did. It makes it seem like it's much more cerebral, like it's an intentional error they're making, and that if they just knew that red arrow pointed back towards their shin, then all of a sudden they'd keep the bar close on the deadlift. And then what do? We get frustrated and we go back and forth. So I found just there was a huge time lag, and they didn't actually get to kinesthetically experience what I'm trying to teach them or show them. I couldn't give them any kind of feedback that was useful. And I found, I remember some of our first mashups or some of our first like posing things that we did. Just for the listeners, I would say from 2010 to 2012, Jeff probably had more people in their underwear in his house than most like sets for pornographic movies, because we had so many get-togethers where we'd have people doing a posing class like in his living room or in his garage, or sometimes my house too, and he'd be over there doing it, and we would always comment on just how much more efficient it was to in person teach someone how to pose compared to once per week thing. So Jeff, I'd love to get your feedback on that, where you used to be, for those who don't know, the 3DMJ posing coach, where you would handle the posing for everybody. You did it online, but then we'd also have these local folks, you get to do it in person. So I'd love to hear that contrast in your experience of teaching people how to move in that respect.
So you remember, Eric, when I was doing all the posing coaching when we first started coaching, and we weren't, like Brad was saying earlier, we weren't using videos or anything like that. So it was like, here, send me your pictures. So the client would send the pictures of their poses. I would make diagrams saying this is where things need to be. And then that would take forever. That wasn't very efficient on my end. And then I would send it back to them. And then they'd have to practice that with no verbal cues, no video cues or nothing. And then resend the pictures a week later and do it all over again. And it's amazing how well it actually kind of worked. Like we would see our clients on stage like, oh, they actually look pretty good. But now, like, as we've evolved, like we do videos back and forth. So even what I've found lately, basically I dish out my posing guide to my athletes. Here, I want you to look at symmetry poses. Here's the guide, study it, practice it on your own. I want you to check in, and then I basically assess it on a weekly basis and then give like video cues, make a video, say, hey, this is what we need to do, and send it to them. That was pretty efficient. Like we were getting quicker results, more efficient. But what I've learned the last couple of years, probably last season and this season, is that I can get on a Skype session with someone and knock out all the symmetry in one session. Whereas going through the weekly check-ins would take roughly anywhere between 4 to 8 weeks to get things perfect. So in one Skype call, 45 minutes to an hour, we've already mastered kind of symmetry in one shot. So, and that's just through video where, I can't put my hands on them. Like in person, like we used to run those camps back in the day, Eric, like it was simple. Like, okay, hey, I need you here. You would, physically turn them or touch them to cue them in, and it's really efficient in person. But through the video, it's like I can use verbal cues. And I can also, like on some poses, you can't really see how their posture is looking, let's say from the side or the back. So I have to kind of turn them certain positions in order to see the posture, in order to make my cues. So even though the video isn't as effective as in person, it's still a heck of a lot better than like just weekly check-ins through photos and videos and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like there's been there's like a hierarchy. Like ideally we're in person, and then there is video. I should say live video, Skyping with someone, for example. Then there's videos back and forth, and then I would say there's videos back and forth in the pre like cell phone era, where you would have to, like, you couldn't look at the video in the gym. You'd have to wait till you go home and then try to remember it from your laptop or desktop and then go to the gym. Yeah. And then lower than that is like pictures. And then lower than that is typing it out. And we've done it all through the years. And I just think of how frustrated I used to get and how little progress I was able to make in some cases, and how it was really just a limitation of the technology at the time. And I think, this is reflected in a lot of things. Like our programming originally was basically just kind of like constraints. Like if we had a bodybuilder, we'd be like, hey, here's a rough amount of volume. Don't always go to failure. Here's how many times we gave him like broad it looked like a little mini like literature review, Here's the range of reps, here's the range of sets, here's the loads you should use. Don't go to failure this often. Here's a good frequency, and pay attention to X, Y, and Z. And then here's all that in a spreadsheet. Now go train. Just try to roughly meet those guidelines, And then it'd be like, it's all up to you, because we didn't feel like we had enough tools to get feedback and modify it. And I think that was, to some degree our inexperience, and then probably to a greater degree, our inability to actually track progress and see what the movements look like. And I remember when we did hit that point, like you were saying, Brad, where all of a sudden we could start getting video feedback, we were all a little shocked at how bad many of our reasonably high level athletes were at moving. And we're like, oh my God, if I had known you were doing a quote unquote RDL like that, I would have never programmed an RDL. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, we need to do something about this. So I think I've always been appreciative that we've coached both powerlifters and bodybuilders, because in powerlifting, there is certain standards, and movement is such a huge part of the sport. It is in bodybuilding as well, but I would love to hear from you, Brad. How do you tackle teaching exercise form online to your powerlifters versus your bodybuilders?
With powerlifters, I almost purposely have to push them out of their comfort zone a little bit, because a lot of times you don't see form break down until they're either pushing very close to failure or they're pushing very heavy loads where they're approaching failure maybe 2, 3, 4 reps, into the set. So with the powerlifters or the aspiring powerlifters, oftentimes they haven't delved into that arena yet. They've kind of mostly done bodybuilding type training, never much below 6, 8 reps, and it's very hard for that type of lifter to distinguish between like true muscular failure and technical failure, and then like straight up cheating. It's like, I haven't failed yet, but now they're not even squatting to depth anymore, or they're not even touching their chest, or what started out as a pretty strict curl now kind of looks more like a semi supinated hand clean. You know what I mean? And so, with those folks, I got to say, okay, you know what? You're not going to be able to get 5 reps with this load, but I want you to keep your reps consistent until they're slowing down. They look the same. They look exactly the same, but they're slowing down. And so that's kind of where I have to kind of push a lot of the power lifters, sometimes even experienced power lifters. Sometimes even experienced power lifters, they know the difference between like true failure with like a single, a double, or a triple. But then if I want to increase their work capacity and maybe have them train to like 10 or 12 repetitions, they don't think they can make it to 10 or 12, you know, just because they start to slow down maybe at like 8 or 9. There's keep your head, keep your cool. You've got more in there. You haven't really slowed down yet, you know? And so that's when sometimes I'll kind of take that avenue and use it more for my bodybuilders. Say, okay, now that you're in 10, 12 reps, shoot, with some of our training now anymore, I'm not even having people count. You know, I kind of found out through all this quarantine training that I don't want you counting. I want you doing repetitions with a light load until you can't keep the repetition looking exactly the same. And that's kind of how I started a while ago, without having a better process or a better system in place, getting my bodybuilders to, let's not get sloppy repetitions with lots of swing and momentum and cheating, right? Keep them all the same. Keep them all the same. And when you technically feel like that movement is no different than the other one, except for you're not able to keep the same speed up, now you're starting to kind of figure out where true kind of a combination of muscular and technical failure is, right? Because technical failure is technically when you're not able to keep that form anymore. If you're swinging that bar up, you're technically keeping the weight moving long past muscular failure, you know? So I don't know, it's kind of hard to put into words what it is that I'm trying to get at. But basically, in a nutshell, power lifters, I push them to push heavier loads and push closer to failure. Bodybuilders, I push them higher reps, but more reproducible repetitions further into the set.
No, that totally makes sense. Because you're basically saying that in both powerlifters and bodybuilders, there can be a discrepancy between technical failure and muscular failure. And for all lifters, we're trying to get those two to become the same. And for powerlifters, they typically only break down when they're actually going to max or when they're fatigued, but they don't train in a way that regularly fatigues them. So you're giving them the opportunity to train in a fatigued state and maintain form, which is probably ingrains good habits. And then likewise, bodybuilders, because their movements don't have a standard, they're more likely to keep doing reps, getting volume, you know, getting a pump, all the things they see as important, but having form be sacrificed. So you can use those moments where things break down to try to bring those 2 points closer together. And I think no greater example of that is Jeff. Jeff, you're someone who's been in the game so long, and you've also trained with paradigms of thinking. Like, you've come from a high intensity background where it's all about taking it to the full capacity or close to it. And one thing I can say is that if you train from that background and you survive, one of the things that the consequence is a very positive consequence is that you really are getting the most out of you can of each set. And you're probably one of the most technically consistent lifters in the bodybuilding world that I've seen. So I'd love to hear your kind of mindset on that, of why that's so important, especially now as your joints don't like to cooperate as much as they used to.
My joints are pissed off lately. That's coming with the territory. That's the age, the mileage. You know, it's interesting. Like, when I first started training, I've always had like the mindset of like, I need to move point A to point B as fluid as possible. I think that kind of just stems from my athletic background. But basically my thought is like, okay, if I move from point A to point B as flawless as possible, like kind of what Brad's talking about, from rep number 1 to the last rep that I can basically put up, that I know all that energy is going to where I want it. Basically, I'm, in a sense, you know, getting all muscle fibers to fire. Like, I'm not asking help from momentum, not asking help from leveraging or anything like that. So I know every rep I'm doing is of high quality. Therefore, in my mind, like, it's effective. And it's just, in a sense, trying to be efficient. And what I've learned through that style of, like, especially on those grinder reps, now I'm speaking of bodybuilding perspective here, that those last grinder reps, like, if I keep them clean, it's basically taught me how to grind, like how to stay composed and have composure, you know, when you're in that fight. I'm not saying, I'm not saying that every single set needs to go to complete failure, but those years that I was training in that fashion, because the volume was lower, I was basically milking the volume I was doing because every rep was as technical as possible. And that's probably what saved me too, because I flash back to all those years of training with that much intensity. I can't say for certain, but I would say that, having that form as pristine as it was probably saved me from, a couple of mishaps, if I was a little bit looser with form.
No, I would agree with that. I think you've been very consistent, and you've kind of have it ingrained into you early in your training career that there should be really high quality repetitions, because that kind of goes hand in hand with a lower volume approach being effective. And I would argue, especially with higher loads, it goes hand in hand with keeping you safe. So I think, obviously, I can't make any strong conclusions that that's the safest way to train or anything like that, but I can at the very least say that's a happy side effect of your training style, is that you have really consistent good form.
I appreciate that, but I also think too, like mentally, it kind of reassured me that I was being safe. It may or may not have actually kept me safe, but mentally, I felt like I was being safe. So it gave me confidence in that style of lifting. Whereas,
so it allowed you to push to failure.
Yeah. So
it gave you the confidence to do so.
Right. And you could look across the board, like you could look at all kinds of successful bodybuilders, and you can see like some have like really like they're form Nazis. They're just like basically perfect, flawless, kind of like myself. And you see other people that are a little bit looser. Like you look at Brad, some of his lifts are a little on the looser side in comparison to mine. Not that it's wrong, but if you look at his development when he was a bodybuilder, you can't argue. Like he basically had to develop physique. So in your opinion, Eric, I mean, someone who's, let's say, perfect with form, or someone who's, let's say, maybe 8 or 9 out of 10 on form, like how much difference is it going to make as far as hypertrophy is concerned, development?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there's two things with how we actually define perfect. I think consistency is probably one of the more important things. I don't think there's any issue with doing like the kind of IFBB style 3/4 reps, a little bit of momentum. If that's always the same, and it's always that way, then you can actually gauge progress. Because I mean, so long as you're loading the tissue, you're good to go. However, I will say that on balance, the data would suggest that the more range of motion you use, the more of a hypertrophy stimulus. When you train a muscle at longer muscle lengths, there's a higher tension stimulus, and it seems to more effectively grow. There is some nuance to that as far as the type of exercise and which muscle group it is, but for the most part, that's a pretty good heuristic. So I think being consistent, using most of the range of motion, and then making sure that however you do the movement, it's actually targeting the muscles you think it is, I do think there are times when cheating can be helpful, as long as it's consistent cheating, but there are other times when it's the opposite of that, and you're not benefiting like the force curve, you're kind of going counter to it. Like for example, I'm really not a fan of like doing really cheaty rows, because you're so much stronger at the full extension phase. And if you cheat right from the start, there's really like, you're kind of controlling it on the eccentric, but that's not a great movement. But other movements you kind of have to, like a little bit of cheating, a little bit of momentum on a lateral raise set, when the load is so far from the fulcrum, like you do them super, super strict, you're going to go from like what feels like a 7 RPE to I can't get it all the way up, So that's just some of the biomechanics of it. But I think consistency is probably the most important thing. And if you are cheating, quote unquote, if you are modifying the performance of the movement so that you can keep going, that it's intentional. It's not because you want to look good for a video. I think that's really important. That's what I would say, kind of on balance.
I would definitely agree with you too, Eric, because I came to a conclusion training somebody else long ago when I was trying to get that balance between consistency and cheating. I've always kind of been an advocate that you don't have to be super, super, super strict, but you at least have to use the same amount of momentum if you're going to use a little bit of momentum on every single repetition. And I remember trying to drill that into a client, and I had them basically do what, something that you could cheat on endlessly if you had the cardio to do it, just a curl. And so I said, okay, I want you to use a little bit of cheat on this curl and try to keep it consistent on every single repetition. And trying to prove a point, they started with too much cheat is kind of the bottom line. And so I was, again, trying to prove a point. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to let them just keep doing this until basically they just can't do it anymore, Well, I mean, shoot, I think it was like rep 50. I finally said, okay, that's enough. That's enough. I've shot myself in the foot here trying to prove the point. But basically, once you start changing that amount of momentum that you're using, you almost cannot define in kind of an internal intuitive feeling when muscular failure truly is. Because you can just keep cheating. You can just keep throwing that weight up endlessly, until your arms fall off or you have a heart attack, one of the two. And it's really hopefully through. Well, hopefully neither, but it's really through watching Jeff and watching how Jeff moves and how consistent his repetitions are. Really, Jeff is amazing in that really his reps never really slow down until the last one. It's like they're all difficult until that one rep where, he either failed, he didn't quite make it down all the way, or, he just kind of knew that there was only going to be, one more left in the tank. His reps were so consistent that it kind of brought me to that conclusion that as soon as something changes in your momentum or your depth or what have you, you've essentially failed. You've gone to what I call an RPE 11. You've gone past a 10 because if you had not cheated, you would not have gotten that repetition.
Right. Now that makes a lot of sense. Jeff, I don't know if did you want to have thoughts on top of me answering?
You can go ahead.
Okay, because
I can see you're itching to say something. So I wish I had like a drink next to me because I could like have my vodka on the rocks while you talk. But yeah, go ahead.
I'll monologue for everyone's benefit, mostly my own. So yeah, the interesting thing about some of the science that we are comfortable with, like on tempo, range of motion, cueing, it's kind of all assuming that the person is past the learning phase of a movement and that the form they use is the one we want them to keep. But that's often not the case. And we kind of had a rude awakening when we started actually getting videos from our clients and some very high level clients, right? So for example, I think there is something to be said for purposely slowing down movements when you're trying to ingrain a new motor pattern, even though we would advise against that. Purposely slowing down the concentric is only going to harm the total muscle recruitment and tension stimulus, right? Another example would be that internal cueing, focusing on a specific muscle group, and an internal cue versus an external cue. Just for those listening, an external cue is something where you're like saying, "Hey, try to put your head to the ceiling," or throw the bar off your chest. It's something that's not inside your body. It's like an action, because the way when you climb a tree, you don't sit there and go, all right, let me flex my hip, and then I'm going to extend my hip, and then I'll flex my knee, and then I'll plantar flex, and now I'm going to go ahead and flex my shoulder, and now I'm going to extend my shoulder while I flex my elbow. Oh, I hear a bird. Let me rotate my head. Like you just react and you move. So when you take these movements that we do naturally, we just try to get to a position in space, and we have proprioception. We understand where each of our joints are through our vestibular sense and all of our little mechanisms in every little part of our body that tells us where we are in space and in relation to ourself. When we try to be overly reductionist with that and try to do something really, really specific with a given joint or a given muscle, it often makes the movement a little less than ideal. And when you look at research on this, for example, in like a curl, you can increase the EMG muscle activity by focusing on the bicep during a curl. However, if you go heavy enough and load, that effect goes away. And it seems to be not very helpful. And when we look at actual task performance, like performance of a movement, we see that external cues typically improve kinetic outputs like power or force, etc. Because we're not trying to think about the movement, we're just trying to execute it in a way and we're being cued. So I think there's kind of a sports science-y, S&C, evidence-based kind of idea that internal cues are bad, okay, and it's not really that like what well thought through. But I actually think there is a time and a place for internal cues, because when you're learning something, going slow, thinking about how it feels, thinking about the mind-muscle connection, moving through a certain space and time, that's not necessarily saying, and that's how you should always perform it, you know? Like, for example, feeling the bar contacting your shins at the start of a deadlift and then pausing and then moving up. Of course, the powerlifter understands that I'm not going to go into a competition and pause in the middle of a deadlift and get a blue card and then, miss my max, right? They know that that's something they're doing to improve motor patterns. And I think that is a really important point, is that a lot of the things that we might use when we're cueing or teaching someone is not where we eventually want them to be performing, but it's a part of that process. And I think sometimes people will misunderstand that very important point. So that's the only point I wanted to make, is that there are some of the quote unquote taboo things we see are not always taboo. And there is a time and a place to re-examine our movement. Let's slow it down. Like, do you actually have time? Or is the load too high? Will slowing it down reduce the load and allow you to actually be mentally aware while you're moving through a certain phase of a lift that you mess up?
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's like me teaching my son how to tie a shoe. I'm not going to say, hey, go as fast as you can. He doesn't even know the pattern of how to tie a shoe.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to start slow. Yeah, it's the same principle.
Yep. And I see it all the time, even with like my son. When they're drilling a particular technique for blocking. It's not like the coach demonstrates it. They do it a couple times, and then they just throw them out on the field and expect them to do it. They break it down. It's like when you're going to do this particular technique, they break it down into sometimes 3 different movements: step, arms back, throw your hips up, explode. And they'll drill like one portion of that movement like 10 times before they add it to the second one. You know what I mean? And it's what when you went through your spew there, Eric, I was envisioning, they're never going to do that on the field. Mm-hmm. But they're drilling that motor pattern to make those movements that might, and some people are natural and some people are not. But it's going to make those people that it's not natural kind of move more like those that are it's more natural for them, and they'll be more efficient and effective on the field.
Yep. And the research on this too is also something that's easily, I wouldn't say misinterpreted, but maybe misapplied. Mm-hmm. So for example, if you've got 2 people doing curls, one person is focused on just lifting the weight from point A to point B as fast as possible, and it's a light load, and the other person is focused on the bicep, and you see a difference in EMG. There's no qualitative examination of whether or not it is a quote unquote good bicep curl either. So mm-hmm. You might have gotten a better output, from doing a movement with a certain type of cueing, but was it a good movement? Another example would be, all right, I put you on a force plate and I say jump as high as you can, and I give you an internal versus an external cue, and we look at which one has more force output on the force plate, or a greater power output, or greater jump height, whatever the design is. And let's say we have the same person go through both, and with an external cue, right in alignment with the rest of the literature, they have a greater kinetic output doing an external cue on this jump, right? That's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's great. And therefore, we should only give external cues if we want to teach jumping. Well, maybe. But what if you use an internal cue as a part of the learning process to make them jump better? And right now, that's going to make them not jump as high because they're relearning the movement phase. Mm. It's not actually a longitudinal study where we've compared the two. Like, another great example is like me when I was first an Olympic lifter, I could power snatch more than I could snatch. It's not supposed to be that way. And I'm still working on correcting that for the record, So like you could give me, certain cues, and you could lower the ceiling, but I could touch it, That's not necessarily a strong lift. It's quite literally maximizing a suboptimal pattern. So it's kind of like, when do you want to take that hit? Do we want to slow down the movement, think about it, and be more cerebral and correct the movement pattern, and then add velocity onto it, and then say, hey, now try to do it without cues. Now try to just do it, before you actually get to it. I think that is something that's often missed. And the research won't tell you that. It can just tell you, I don't know what the hell you did, but it met the research criteria for a curl or a jump. And maybe it had a higher EMG with internal, and maybe you had a higher jump height with external, but we don't actually know about how we could use those type of cues over time. We don't necessarily know whether the quality of that jump was high or low. Is that actually a jump that everyone would wince if you were doing that in a basketball game, landing with your knees touching? Or are we, do we want to be maximizing the force output on a crappy ass jump, or do we want to actually take it back to the drawing board? So I think that's one of those things. It's like the research isn't wrong, but often how it's applied. And I've been guilty of this as well. Like I kind of had thought, I can't give any internal cues. Now I think sometimes internal cues on game day are a bad idea. Like for example, yelling hips at somebody in the middle of a powerlifting meet. I don't know what that means. Are you a fan of hips? Are you identifying that they have hips? Do you want them? I mean, how do they? What is that? Like, I don't know. That's not even a cue that means anything. Maybe it does. Maybe you've already established it. But like when I hear people yell a bunch of cues at someone in the middle of a competition, and many of them are internal, I don't know what they're expecting that lifter to do with it. I think the lifter most time just ignores it and does what they're going to do, and it just gives the coach a sense of emotional expression and being involved in the process. But so yeah, I think sometimes we need to get a little more pragmatic. This is one of those times where I think the research just takes away options, where if you were to actually try to do internal and external cues, you would see that some just wouldn't work, because presumably you're going to be going back and forth with this person on a pose or a movement, and you're going to find certain cues do or don't work. Like I know with posing. Go ahead, Jeff.
I was to say that's use my son as an example again when he was playing baseball. Like I wasn't standing, in the stands yelling about his swing, because I knew if I did, it was just going to mess him up. Like he's going to start thinking too much. So even if his swing is a little off, I'd rather have him. That's more of a natural swing for him at that specific time. I can always correct things later. And kind of same thing in the gym. Like if you're watching someone, like if you guys were personal trainers, I know you guys in the middle of a set, you're not telling, hey, you need to do this. You kind of wait until they're done with the set, then go over the corrections that need to be made. But doing it while you're actually in the moment, I mean, that's probably the worst time to try to correct someone as far as their form.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, especially when they're under load, if maybe it's a warm-up set or something like that, sure. But motor learning is a very interesting thing. We're trying to get very, very consistent movements, but we don't always necessarily get there by just doing the movement consistently. Because you have to actually get to that point in the first place. There was another cool study, I think we reviewed it way back in the very beginning of Mass, and it was talking about using a technique where you purposely give them an error that exaggerates what they're already doing wrong, right? Now, the way I've always thought of this is basically when you're an early phase learner of a movement, you basically have a really insensitive radar system, right? You're not really quite aware of where your knee is in space, when your back is rounding, etc. Right? So like if you're watching someone do a front squat, and when they come out of the hole, their elbows come down and they kind of round their back a little bit, that's only a problem once the weight gets so heavy or they get so fatigued that they lose it forward. And so they're not aware that it's an issue. Their radar is not sensitive enough. But you want to fix that real quick as you make sure they're in a rack. For the record, make sure they're in the squat rack with the pin set of the right height, and then have them go, all right, now on your next set of front squats, I want you to keep your elbows down and watch them dump the bar real quick, and they'll become aware of it. And there was actually a study that showed, it's called amplification of error. When you take an existing error that someone's doing, and this is specific to the Olympic weightlifting, where there's a lot of technical cues. So it's a better vehicle for this example. When they amplified the error that the coach identified, it basically allowed that blip on the radar to show up on that relatively insensitive radar system. Like, oh, I see what I'm doing wrong here. And then they could correct it. This was something I got exposed to in personal training a long time ago. So like if someone's knees are caving in on a squat and you want their knees to track with their feet a little more, put a band around their knees, pulling their knees in. Because then they can really feel their knees going in, and that will cue them to fight against it.
Out.
Yeah. Not you wouldn't want to like attach bands to the wall next to them or a pole around there to pull it out for them, right? Because they're going to try to resist whatever they feel. So essentially, you're trying to amplify their own awareness of the issues they're making by making the error more obvious. And I think that's one of those counterintuitive things. Like a lot of the times as coaches, you can easily just get into that corrective mode. You know, like I know it's a joke. It's not actually what like Max Aida does, but he has like this cup that says, "Do it again, but do it less shitty." You know, it's kind of like cloak off, like again faster. Like that's not actually how they're coaching, but it's a great example of just kind of the meme of the coach who just points out everything you're doing wrong and then just says, "Now do it right." You know, and that's unsurprisingly not that effective.
Hey guys, this is Andrea, just popping in to let you know about our newest course in the 3DMJ Vault. It's called Transitioning Away from Tracking, and it's the exact course I wish I had like 6 years ago when I was still terrified of eating out and had no idea what it felt like to be satiated. While many people have the desire to stop being a slave to the food scale and food tracking apps, they aren't always sure how to do that in a safe, effective, and systematized manner that will allow them to make this shift without diminishing the physical progress they've worked so hard to earn and maintain. In this video course, we'll give you all the tools you've been looking for and more. Transitioning Away from Tracking was created by Steve Taylor, our team's registered dietitian, and Eric Helms, our chief science officer. They start with an overview of the science and research surrounding tracking behaviors, present you with constructs and tactics on how to productively make your transition, and leave you with ongoing tools to ensure long-term effectiveness. This course just came out last month. It only costs $18 for unlimited access to the videos, tech supplements, and downloadable resources that accompany it. To learn more about this course from Eric Helms, to sign up for the free trial, or to buy full access, go to 3dmjvault.com. Again, that's 3dmjvault.com to view all of our video courses, including this new one, Transitioning Away from Tracking. Thanks in advance for checking it out, and enjoy the rest of the show.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was my first RKC when they basically did that drill. You know, they would have people do goblet squats when their knees caved in, and a lot of the RKC is just, what did they call it? It's basically fixing and correcting, call it incorrect movement patterns. And I remember that was one of the things that they did. They didn't have bands there at the time, obviously, but they would have them do goblet squats, push fairly, close to failure, because, most people aren't just going to be able to just clean up and squat like a 40-kilo bell, right? So they would have them do repetitions continuously, and then about the time that they start really suffering, they would just push in on their knees. And that would a lot of times fix the cue, because then once they allowed them to recover and, they did do something heavier where they reached failure a lot sooner, the knee caving in was not nearly as obvious. And I want to say, it's been so long and my memory's gotten so bad, but I want to say it was either Dan John or Brett Jones that was doing that. Like literally just kneeled down in front of them, pushing in on their knees. And then it's like, I know it hurts. I know it burns, but give me another one. Give me another one. Stay calm. I know it hurts. Give me another one. Then after they recovered, cleaned up a little heavier bell, sure enough, it was like magic. That was when cueing to me like became something that I became infatuated with.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a perfect example of magnifying the error so the person is aware of it and helping them stay aware during fatigue, which is when it breaks down. That's the most frustrating thing too, is that a lot of these things we're trying to correct will artificially lower the ceiling on your strength. When you go to a really high level powerlifting competition, when those third attempts start coming out, they're really quite impressive in that they just get slower. But if you go to a novice level meet, or you watch, say, the juniors, people who just don't have as much lifting experience, you will start to see a different squat or a different deadlift or a different bench happen, even when they get white lights, as they get into their towards their peak strength. And it's low hanging fruit for a coach, where if they can see that, you know what, if you could have, maintained the positions where you're the strongest, we know your max would be even higher. So I think that kind of goes back to what you were saying, Brad, where you put your athletes in a position where they are forced to have their technique challenged based on what they're regularly exposed to, either bodybuilder or powerlifter. And I think some of that, that's us, because we're not there in person, we can embed some motor learning tools in programming. And this is something that is a huge part of Olympic lifting. Like, you will specifically select movements in Olympic lifting to assist with the technical deficiencies someone has. And that happens in powerlifting, but a lot of people don't even know they're doing it. Like, they'll do a pause deadlift below the knees because Boroshaiko, not because they realize that when that is used by a certain coach, they're doing it to give them an opportunity to be aware of an error. They're magnifying a potential for an error, so you have to correct it. Like Mike T talks about this a good bit. He likes to give assistance movements which punish bad habits and reward good habits. So someone who kind of caves in on a squat and tends to lose the bar a little forward and their hips shoot back, he gives them front squats because it punishes you immediately when you do that, and it forces you to stay more upright. To give you an Olympic lifting example, if someone is trying to sneak under the bar and they start their third pull too early, just have them start at the top, do a tall snatch or a tall clean, where you don't get to do anything. You have to get it high enough to get under it. So there's a lot of different tools that are out there. And I think because powerlifting is a less technical sport than something like Olympic lifting, or really any other sport for the most part, I think there's a kind of this general misunderstanding of what assistance lifts are for. It's kind of like, I'm doing this movement and I don't know if it's for hypertrophy. I don't know if it's force development in a specific joint. I don't know if it's movement pattern correction. But I do know someone I follow on Instagram says to do it, so I choose that on my squat day, And I think if powerlifters could become a little more aware of the role of different assistance exercises, like obviously a lat pull down is not in that category, But for example, a pin squat or a front squat, it kind of covers both, right? You obviously can get big or stronger, and you can challenge certain joint angles, and you can eliminate some of the eccentric contribution to the stretch shortening cycle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things you can use that also are kind of those corrections of errors. So I think once you start looking at your lifters' movements online, even from a video, even though you can't cue them very well, you can start to think, all right, I don't want them to do X, Y, or Z in terms of the way they're moving under or over that bar. So what accessories or movement variations of that lift will force them to move the way I want, or at least reward them if they move that way, or punish them if they don't. And I think that's it's probably under talked about in powerlifting, I would say. I don't know if like Brad, would you agree with that? How often do you hear powerlifters talking about accessory movements that way?
Yeah. To be honest with you, that's a nice refresher for me, really, because I don't know. A lot of times when I think of accessory movements, I kind of think, okay, that person, they're less erect than I want them to be, and so naturally the bodybuilder,
3D MJers.
Leave it to Brad, right?
Shit. Boy, now you're going to make my face turn all red, Eric.
So how do you improve the arousal state of your clients so that they're more erect, Brad? Help us understand.
Okay, let me rephrase that. They're not as upright as I want them to be. Their posture, maybe, is not as good. Spinal posture is not as good as I want it to be. But yeah, the bodybuilder in me automatically says, okay, well, you know what I need to do? I need to strengthen their lats. I need to strengthen their erectors. I need to strengthen the muscle group that is responsible for that. And you've just given me a nice little kind of a refresher course in what I learned in the RKC, a long time ago. maybe the strength is there. I just need to reinforce the movement pattern, you know? And yeah, that just goes to show you that, I mean, here I am, a powerlifting coach that reads mass and you know, has a PhD in strength and conditioning on his team. You know, I think that answers the question as to how often powerlifting coaches and powerlifters in general probably talk about that.
Yeah. And I think it's even more influenced by the bodybuilding world, you know, like in certain sports, they think of movement and they think of vectors and they think of like horizontal force, vertical force, you know, they think of, you know, things like the global movement because the sport is so movement dependent. But in the fitness world, we're so influenced by bodybuilding that we're very muscle focused, you know, like we think, oh, I'm starting to see you good morning that a little bit. Okay, we need stronger erectors. And someone else is like, no, that's not it. They went into that position because they have weak quads. And they like, so the question is not who's right, but is the whole paradigm of thinking always right?
Right, yeah.
Like, you know? And I think we will often overemphasize muscles in bodybuilding. It's not to say that couldn't be the cause. Don't get me wrong, you know? Like having weak pecs on a bench press, you're going to have problems, you know? But at the same time, we will often make assumptions within the constraints that we're given. And if we think that muscles are the primary thing we need to be working with, then, you know, you could see someone struggling with lockout and the answer is tricep pushdowns. And I just don't know how much transfer you're going to get there, you know, because the movements are so different. And you can see like a lot of these things play out and it trickles into the powerlifting world where absolutely, like you were saying, you know, we'll use these accessory movements and we won't necessarily know why we're using them, but we might be coming from a paradigm of bodybuilding. Like that's a muscular issue. But a lot of the times they're just not being used in that movement pattern in a neuromuscularly efficient way. So I think there's a lot to be learned from looking across the aisle at strength athletes and also to bodybuilders as well. But I think I guess that my message here is it's just really important to remember that muscles are there to move, you know, and when we disassociate them from that and really think in a kind of a muscle-centric viewpoint, we can miss out on some of the ways that we might program in a certain way, which I think are even more important when you're online. And you can use other variables. So another thing that I do, like you were talking, Brad, and you were talking about this as well, Jeff, that at less experienced stages, or if it's not been emphasized, when you get close to failure, form breaks down. Well, I think a great way to ingrain, you know, working on that is just give a lot of submaximal work during a phase where that's appropriate. Obviously, you wouldn't be giving someone like 6 RPEs at, you know, when they're 2 weeks out from meet or something like that. But if you want to get someone really good at moving and the only way they've ever moved is properly, then you'll probably have a greater chance than if you were to take someone with a faulty movement pattern and use a very failure-centric type approach, you know? Like I like what you were saying, Brad, like, okay, you don't move well. I'm going to have you go to failure to expose the issue and then we'll do something about it. That's very different than saying you don't move very well. I'm going to give you a program with 9 to 10 RPE all the time and make sure you have a spotter. See you in 8 weeks. And I think that's more likely to ingrain, you know, issues.
Yeah, I think when you're using obviously lighter intensities, I mean, yeah, you're going to have more composure. So let's say someone gets really good at that, right? They correct the movement pattern, they're really good, but now they're not exposed to now higher intensities. So that's another layer, in my opinion. Like, okay, now once this person gets exposed to this new pattern they learned, now going to higher intensities, sometimes it's mindset at that point, like having composure when you're in those harder reps towards the end. And so I think that's something that needs to be learned as well. And it's a skill in itself.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, you've actually talked about this before. I'm not sure on the podcast, but definitely on your Instagram. And I really had me nodding my head where you've talked about how with your lifters or your athletes, I should say, you'll basically give them the opportunity to use heavier loads if they've demonstrated that they can do proper form with lighter loads. And that's actually part of your system. So could you talk about that a little bit, how you've used that? I don't know if you still do, but in the past, I know you've kind of operationalized that.
So not across the board entirely, but I mean, it's pretty obvious to me. Like if I'm seeing not too great form, once we get deep into a set, then hey, okay, first thing is like, hey, you need to pull load back, or hey, let's cut a little bit of that intensity down and correct the form. So it's always like take one step back to take two steps forward. But what I like to teach, and I had one of my athletes from Singapore that was training with me in my gym. And what I noticed with him was he had good form, but once he got into like, okay, we're getting closer to failure, like 1 or 2 reps in reserve there, he thought it was 1 or 2 reps in reserve. But once I kind of controlled his breathing, had him more composed in that latter stage of the set, he was able to crank out in there 4 or 5 more reps. So what was happening was, you get in that fight or flight state, once you start to feel the end of the set. And a lot of people, they'll basically start to get that anxiety. And, all of a sudden the focus goes from, okay, now having this composure and form now to I need to basically get in there and try to use everything I have to move this weight. And that's where you see the form breakdown. That's where you see the leverages shift and things like that. So what I was trying to teach them within that session was like, hey, once we get to that harder stage of the set, I want you to relax internally, relax your face, like try to, keep your facial expressions from getting too crazy. Don't yell or grunt, but just stay composed and stay within the movement, meaning don't break your movement pattern. Like Brad was saying, rep 1 needs to look like rep 10. So basically, yeah, he was pretty much amazed by how many more reps he was able to generate with like the same movement pattern.
Yep. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think I've seen you talk about how you can have a technical score for how well you felt you stayed in the movement like you talked about. And so like I think I've seen this in your own programming. Like if I get a 9 or 10 out of 10 on my technical score, and I was able to complete all the programmed reps with all the sets, okay, next week, only then will I go up and load. And I think that's a nice way to avoid a lack of consistency, because I think we get so focused on progress, especially when we're coached and we've given guidelines on how to progress, and there's progression schemes written into our programs as an athlete, that you are more likely to sacrifice form for progressive overload, quote unquote. And I think that's a really good way of you're operationalizing form in some way to say, hey, you get to progress, but with only if you also meet this certain standard. So you're kind of using it like a carrot, we can use more load. However, I want to see a 9 out of 10 rating on the technical side of it. So am I representing that appropriately? Yeah.
So, I mean, my definition of form, like, okay, no momentum, no leveraging, like it's flawless, point A to point B. It's just that muscle's, in this bodybuilding perspective, that muscle is doing all the work. 9 out of 10, maybe a little bit of momentum, not too much leveraging. 8 out of 10 is like, okay, you're obviously like using a little bit of swing, momentum, you're shifting your leverage. So anything below 9, I'm like, okay, this person, you either need to lower the load down or maintain load until you can basically get yourself to a 9 or 10 out of 10. And only when you're at 10 out of 10, okay, you're probably at a point where you should be able to at least maybe increase load or increase reps or whatever. But anything below that, it's like, if you lower the load down, make the corrections, and you get that form up. So let's say you're using leveraging or momentum, like, again, maybe you're shortening the range of motion by doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're bringing the form up and you're moving, even though the load might be a little bit less, if you're getting more range of motion, then in my mind, you might be equating volume anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And you're setting yourself up. You're setting yourself up for future success, more sustained progress, because you're cleaning your form up. You're more consistent across the board with it. So I like to think big picture, not just, hey, I'm what am I doing this week through next week as far as load? But I'm thinking like, okay, what's things are going to look like a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years down the road? Because if I'm maintaining that consistency, then you're going to get, not in a nutshell, if you're not on the sidelines, if you're in the game playing, you're playing effectively, coach is going to keep you in. You're going to keep scoring points.
Eric, maybe you can address that a little bit, if there is any science on that, where you do purposely, kind of bring effort or not effort, I don't want to say, but just RPE down a little bit. Because I have a lot of times where I'm trying to push the threshold of reproducibility of repetitions higher and higher and higher. So I might have them purposely trained to a 7 RPE, where the reps really don't noticeably slow down over several weeks, and then using the same load. Okay, now for the next 2 weeks, push it to an RPE 8, where it's like it either feels or it looks slow, and keep adding RPE. But a lot of times I get questions on, well, how effective is training consistently to a low RPE, an RPE of 7 or whatever? And I don't really have a right answer, except I remember, again, from my RKC days, and this kind of echoes what Jeff said as far as being in the game. If you're lifting weights, practice is progress. Practice is working out, and that's something that Pavel would just drill into us, is that, practice is working out. But what do you know, or is there anything that kind of shows what the benefits are, if there is any, hypertrophy-wise, from consistently training as part of your program to a lower RPE?
That's a really good question, and I think it. I'm not going to have a super scientific answer, but I will have.
Oh, come on!
I mean, this is the most scientific answer ever. No, but I will have a useful answer for people who really think about things from kind of like a scientific, acute variables impact on hypertrophy perspective. So, people who are thinking, well, a low RPE means that I'm not as close to failure. I'm getting less motor unit recruitment. I'm not putting as much of a tension stimulus. I'm getting less quote unquote effective reps. I shouldn't be training that way. There needs to be a certain threshold. I don't want to do a volume block with a bunch of 5 to 7 RPEs because then it's a lot of junk volume, right? But another way to look at that is, are you being a little too short-sighted? Because if we're using lower RPE training to ingrain consistency and form, we're not thinking about how effective is this block for improving hypertrophy. We're thinking, how can we ingrain really good motor patterns so that a year from now, when you do your volume block, we could use higher RPEs? Because the whole premise of your question, Brad, is that we're using lower RPEs to see more consistent form. Because if we can't see consistent form at a higher RPE, are those really effective reps? And if they are effective, are they effective for training the muscle group you think you're training? Mm-hmm. So I think this comes back to the two overlapping paradigms of thinking. One, the immediate kind of fear of missing out, science-driven anxiety perspective of I need my training to be really effective now. And the other one is the kind of bodybuilder-centric, it's all about stimulating muscle and forgetting that strength is a skill and that we stimulate muscle through movement. So if you kind of get past those two fears, or that one fear and that one paradigm of thinking, you can then understand that from a motor learning perspective, and this is said really well, practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent, right? So if you're so afraid of doing things that aren't stimulating muscle, that you're training at high RPEs or to or past failure with shitty form, the one thing you can be sure is that yes, you are going to have quote unquote effective reps for whatever you're training. Could be like your tendons, I don't know, could be your soft tissue or the wrong muscle. But you're also ingraining poor form. So it's kind of that same example of me power snatching. You're bringing the ceiling down for short-term benefits. Like, yeah, I do think if you took the same two people and one did 5 sets at a 7 RPE and one did 5 sets at a 9 RPE, and one was a little worse form, but not too horribly different, especially on like assistance movements. The 5 at a 9, if you were to quantify that stimulus, it would be better. But honestly, in the long term, the person who is correcting their form by using that 7 RPE is going to be having more effective training down the line and for the rest of their whole career. So that's the way I see it, is that we have to understand that we don't just get to train muscles. We have to train our body through training muscles, through training movements. And that means that if our movements are not training muscles as effectively as they can be, if we haven't improved our technical capabilities to be hitting the target muscle groups, and we would benefit in terms of the actual quality of movement by lowering the RPE, that's a worthwhile investment. And I think that's the way I would frame it, is that this is an investment. And you will get to earn a volume block at a 6 to 8 RPE instead of a 5 to 7 RPE once you can demonstrate that you can perform it to the same technical quality.
Okay, yeah, excellent answer. So what about like our bodybuilding movements? Like let's say a curl or a side lateral raise or a leg extension or a leg curl or something like that. Do you feel like it would be beneficial as part of the program to purposely train that muscle to a lower RPE? And then like Jeff said, when your form rating is a 10 out of 10 and you are definitely stimulating that muscle in the way that it's supposed to move, then you can move into higher RPE and things like that. Because I don't know, to me, it's kind of like those aren't opposite ends of the spectrum. You know, it's kind of like they kind of meet in the middle.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're talking about applies really well to free weight compound exercises. You know, there's a higher injury risk. It's not entirely clear what are the dominant muscle groups for you. You know, someone with a way longer femurs and a way shorter torso is probably going to get a different stimulus from a back squat than someone built with short nubby nubs. So I think what we need to understand is that a lot of you can kind of take a more muscle-centric approach and be a little less concerned with form. I still think consistency is important. When you're doing isolation bodybuilding movements that are low risk, they're not going to produce that much fatigue either. I mean, how tired do you get on like machines or single joint movements? It's not that much compared to deadlifts, squats, you know, bent over rows, overhead presses, things like that. So if I was to kind of synthesize everything we've talked about, a useful heuristic, a way of simplifying this, is think about movements in terms of what is a technical movement. For the most part, compound free weight movements is on one end of that spectrum, and on the other end of the spectrum is single joint machines, and everything falls somewhere in between, you know? And I think the closer you get to the technical side, you want to do things like training with low RPEs, having a certain threshold of technical ability that you could even operationalize 1 out of 5, 1 out of 10 like Jeff does before you go up and load or try to add more reps. You might want to use techniques like amplification of error. You might want to slow down the velocity and do internal cueing if it improves your form as part of the learning phase, but then you want to get away from that and use external cues because it's a performance movement. And that's kind of where you're trying to get to on that side. And I guess I'm kind of doing like the takeaways now for this episode. And then the other side on the far left, where we're talking about like a preacher curl machine or a single leg curl or you know, a cable lateral raise with one arm, for example. It's really hard to do these that poorly. I think you just want to be consistent. It could be like an 8 out of 10 quality, so long as it's always at least that. And you can feel free to progressively overload it, just because there's not a whole lot of consequences to doing that poorly. If we're assuming you're training with a fair number of compound movements using those, it's kind of like just the filling in the gaps of that brick wall. It's the spackling. You know, you're just trying to make sure that you're not leaving anything out. So I'm not too concerned if someone's a little cheaty on their cable lateral raises, but it's reasonably consistent. If their overhead press, their bent over rows, and everything else that day were really pristine, if their bench press was solid. So I think nothing wrong with an internal cue where you don't have a performance metric to try to meet, and you can't really mess it up that bad. You know, your preacher curl machine, yeah, think about the pump and the burn and the bicep moving. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Don't think of like, I need to throw my hand upwards towards the sky or anything like that, you know? I think that's kind of the perspective I would give. And I think naturally that also means that the further you get away from the technical side of things, naturally the RPEs can be higher. You know, you can take a lateral raise to the house, and how much consequence will there be? There's only mostly just benefits to be gained.
To a certain point, right? Unless you're flapping your arms, jumping up and down on your lateral raise, not even really stimulating the deltoid.
If you are in danger of becoming part of a gym fail meme video or GIF, then this does not apply. And I think, you know, the example you gave was great, Brad, where you allowed someone to use maximal body English on curls, and they were probably getting a massive lower back pump, you know, and there was probably, like, if you film them from the side, there was probably this kind of movement in their torso, you know, like, yeah, you could do you could grab, and we've seen it, on the internet, rarely in person, but sometimes you can take it way too far, absolutely. And I think whatever you're doing, as far as, this kind of goes back to my first point, quote unquote, cheating on isolation movements, it should be in service of getting more stimulation, not less. So for example, like let's say you're doing rows, and on rows, it gets harder and harder the closer you get to your chest, right? So you're doing your set of rows. These are like cable rows, right? And, you get to your chest and you barely get there. And you decide to throw a little bit of a back extension through the first part so you can get it a little closer to you and you can get one more rep where you're fighting. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it's in your head and you're intentionally doing that to get a few more reps and where you're stimulating that end range of motion, where you're fighting the force curve. Okay. If you're doing lateral raises and you start just doing partials because you just can't get it as high because the fulcrum is so far from you and you're still getting a good pump and you're getting a little more volume there. Okay. The only downside to doing that is it's difficult to track progress. So I think that there's nothing wrong with that, but I think you have to be okay with having a little bit of a murkier idea of what's going on. It's kind of like I've talked about before, like drop sets work, and rest pause sets work. But how do they compare to straight sets? Don't know. It's very difficult to compare that because straight sets have a very predictable, like the muscle unit recruitment is going to keep going upward and the stimulus is going to be going upward. Rest pause, you're kind of starting semi-fatigued. So you're somewhere along that line and then you're getting supposedly more effective reps. But how do we count it? I don't know.
It's hard to quantify it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think you can make a logical rationale for it, but then you need to figure out some system of tracking it. And that's a whole nother conversation.
It's another podcast.
It is. So I think if we can wrap some things up, some points you guys made, you probably want to have some way of, if you're a coach, assessing the form of your athletes. And you need to understand kind of that hierarchy we talked about. Like being in person, that's ideal. You're probably not going to be able to do that. But getting live on Skype, you can absolutely do that for not only posing, but also them moving. Probably can't get them in the gym doing that, but for certain things, you absolutely could. People probably have more exercise equipment at home now than they ever had before. So you could definitely play with like a kettlebell squat or something like that. And then videos are great. And now you can actually look at that with your headphones on while you're in the gym. And remember that you shouldn't just be correcting things. You want to make sure that you give people cues that are useful. Like you want to help them. You try amplification of error, but not in a way that would hurt them. You can like Brad talked about, like if your knees are coming in, you can, wear a band to pull them in even more. So it helps you feel it and then take them off. That's not a permanent solution. It's part of the motor pattern process. So yeah, anything else?
Can I mention
Jeff,
one thing that I do? Well,
Yeah.
I want to mention one thing personally that I do because coaching form is not, let's say, my specialty. And I know that. So what I do, if I feel like I can't give enough of a good description or I can help someone, I'll go on YouTube and I'll search. I'll look up videos where the person's credible. They're really good at explaining things. And I'll say, here, watch this video. And I think these cues will actually help you out. And I'll have them watch it, practice it, come back, report back to me, and we'll look at it together and see if it's actually, improved or not. So in a sense, I resource out sometimes when I feel like I need to, as far as my coaching, not just like form cues, but other things too. Like I'm always looking at other people or other means to basically deliver information outside of myself.
Awesome. And I think shameless plug time before you go, Brad, is to resource in instead of resourcing out. We do have the lifting library that is actually a really useful way of giving you visual cues and stuff like that. That said, the only downside of it is it is kind of meant to be looked at on a computer a little more in depth. It's more explanatory. I think looking at it, learning it cerebrally, and then applying it, giving yourself some cues and notes that you write down that when you go to the gym, that's probably the best way to use it. But anyway, I just wanted to do that shameless plug to help us pay the bills. But Brad,
and we must be on the same wavelength, Eric, because I was also going to make a shameless plug, but not only for the lifting library, but then also for the posing guide too. Because one thing I can say is, since we've come out with those resources, a lot of our clients have come to us a lot better prepared. not only lifting wise, but then also posing wise. It's amazing to me that anymore I can get people really in good presentation in as little as 5 weeks sometimes when they come to themselves prepared like that. So yeah, I was with you on there. But one thing I did want to kind of include as kind of a takeaway that I'm going to probably start doing that I had never even thought about before was with regard to posing. If I don't want somebody to, on their side symmetry pose, do the old punch the judges type of approach with their front arm, I might have them exaggerate that so that they can quit doing that and perhaps correct that through, exaggeration. And then, okay, on your next pose or the next part of the video, I want you to kind of do it right. People that tend to put their arms too low when they do a biceps pose, I might purposely have them do it really low, put their elbows way down, pose like that, and then have them correct it. I just kind of picked up kind of a little cue there.
Here's the cue for that, Brad. Smell your armpits.
Love it. Awesome. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed the insights here. Hopefully you've got some tools, takeaways, and practical examples of how, as an online coach, you can use the limitations as best you can to teaching things, how you can use RPE, tempo, internal versus external cueing, amplifying errors, and different movement selections, and categorizing movements different ways so you can get a better way of helping your athletes move better. Also thinking of accessory movements not just as good or bad, but potentially as ways of rewarding or punishing a certain movement pattern. And I hope everyone gets better movement, and we'll see you next time on the 3DMJ podcast.
Hey guys, this is Coach Alberto Nunez. Thanks so much for listening to our show today. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. I wanted to take a moment to remind you guys that we have a giant video library of educational materials at 3dmjvault.com. The vault is a place where we have organized our best information, paired it up with some of our favorite resources, and shared with all of you guys in one online database. We have courses on contest prep, hypertrophy, posing, fat loss, postseason recovery, and a whole lot more. Most of it is free. Some of it is for purchase to help support this podcast, and we continue adding pieces of updated content to it every couple of months that members always have unlimited access to. Once again, that's 3dmjvault.com, and we really hope you like it.